When scientists began studying the DNA from the skeleton found under a parking lot in Leicester, they thought it would confirm once and for all that the remains belonged to King Richard III. But what they discovered instead shocked the world. The DNA results didn't just tell the story of one king, they revealed secrets that could change how we understand royal history itself. When geneticists compared Richard III's Y chromosome with that of living male relatives who traced their ancestry back to his family, something didn't match. The link between the king and his supposed male descendants was broken. Suddenly, historians, scientists, and royal experts were faced with a mystery that challenged everything. They thought they knew about the English monarchy. The story began more than 5 centuries ago when King Richard III was killed in the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. His death ended the bloody wars of the Roses and brought the Tudor dynasty to power. Historical records said Richard's body was carried to Leicester and buried without ceremony at the Grey Friars Priory. But the monastery was later destroyed, and its location was lost to time. Some even believed that Richard's bones had been thrown into a river. For generations, his grave became one of England's greatest mysteries, until 2012, when archaeologists decided to dig under a city parking lot built over the area where the Grey Friars once stood. At first, few people believed they would find anything meaningful. But within days, the excavation team uncovered a human skeleton buried in what would have been the choir of the priory. The bones immediately caught everyone's attention. They belonged to a man in his early 30s, about the same age as Richard III when he died. The skeleton showed clear signs of violent death. Deep wounds to the skull suggested he had been struck by swords and halberds. There were also injuries that hinted his helmet had been removed during the chaos of battle, matching written accounts of Richard's final moments as he fought bravely, but was overwhelmed by his enemies. One of the most striking details was the man's spine. It had a severe curve caused by scoliosis, which would have made one shoulder appear higher than the other. This detail matched descriptions written by those who saw Richard in person. Chroniclers described him as having uneven shoulders, though later plays and stories, especially Shakespeare's famous portrayal, turned him into a hunchbacked villain. The skeleton proved that Richard's deformity had been real, but far less extreme than what legend suggested. Carbon dating confirmed that the bones dated back to the late 1400s. Chemical testing showed the man had eaten a rich diet heavy in meat and fish, which fit someone of noble birth. The burial site itself matched the old descriptions of where Richard was said to have been laid to rest. All signs pointed toward the skeleton being the long-lost king. Yet archaeologists knew that physical evidence alone could not serve as absolute proof. They needed scientific confirmation, something that could connect this skeleton to Richard III's living relatives beyond doubt. That was where DNA came in. Modern science allowed researchers to do something that would have been impossible even a few decades earlier. By analyzing genetic material preserved in bones, scientists could compare it to DNA from people alive today who were related to Richard's family. If the genetic codes matched, it would be strong proof that the skeleton really was the king's. Since Richard III had no surviving children, scientists turned to his extended family tree. His mother, Cecily Neville, had several children, and through her daughters the family line continued for centuries. Researchers traced that line through one of Richard's sisters, Anne of York, identifying living descendants connected through the maternal line. This was crucial because mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, is passed from mother to child almost unchanged. That means all descendants in a direct female line share the same mtDNA. Scientists eventually found 2 people, a furniture maker in London named Michael and a genealogist from Canada named Wendy, who could trace their ancestry back to Anne of York through an unbroken maternal line. If their mitochondrial DNA matched that of the skeleton, it would be strong evidence that the remains were indeed Richard III's. The scientists also decided to test the paternal line, which is traced through the Y chromosome. The Y chromosome is passed from father to son almost unchanged, generation after generation. Even though Richard had no direct male descendants, other men from the broader Plantagenet family, descendants of Edward III, one of Richard's ancestors, should, in theory, share the same Y chromosome. Among them were members of the Somerset family who descended from Henry Somerset, the 5th Duke of Beaufort. Extracting DNA from bones that had been buried for more than 500 years was not easy. The genetic material was fragile, and contamination from modern DNA could ruin the results. Scientists worked in sterile laboratories wearing full protective suits. They drilled into the skeleton's teeth and dense bones, areas most likely to preserve DNA. The fragments they collected were carefully cleaned, copied millions of times, and then pieced together like a jigsaw puzzle to create a readable genetic sequence. When the mitochondrial DNA results came back, the scientists were thrilled. The DNA from the skeleton matched perfectly with that of both modern descendants, Michael and Wendy. The chances of this being a coincidence were almost zero. To most experts, this proved beyond reasonable doubt that the remains under the parking lot belonged to Richard III. The world celebrated the discovery as one of the greatest archaeological finds in British history. But then came the twist. When researchers compared the skeleton's Y chromosome with that of the Somerset family, the results didn't match. Instead of confirming a direct male line connection to the Plantagenet dynasty, the test revealed a break somewhere along the family tree. In other words, somewhere between Edward III and Richard III, or possibly between Edward III and the modern Somerset descendants, a man recorded in royal history as a legitimate son was not, in fact, the biological child of his supposed father. This phenomenon is known in genetics as a false paternity event. In plain terms, it means that at some point in the royal bloodline, an illegitimate child had been passed off as legitimate. This revelation stunned historians. The royal family's legitimacy had always been built on unbroken descent from past kings. If a false paternity event had occurred, it meant that part of the royal lineage could have been based on a mistake, or a secret that had been hidden for centuries. But where had this break occurred? That question became the subject of intense debate. If the event had happened early, perhaps in one of Edward III's many sons or grandsons, it could potentially undermine the legitimacy of many later kings who claimed descent from that branch. But if it occurred later, possibly closer to Richard III's time, then it might have had little effect on later royal claims. Scientists couldn't pinpoint when the break happened without more DNA samples from other Plantagenet burials. What was certain, though, was that the royal bloodline was not as pure and continuous as many people once believed. Despite this twist, the mitochondrial DNA evidence was so strong that scientists concluded the skeleton really was Richard. 3. The remains were later reburied in Leicester Cathedral in a grand ceremony, attended by members of the royal family and thousands of spectators. Yet the discovery left behind questions that reached far beyond one grave. The Y chromosome mystery reignited centuries-old debates about legitimacy, succession, and the reliability of royal genealogies. Historians began to re-examine records, trying to find where the hidden break might have occurred. Was it during the turbulent times following Edward III's reign, when rival factions fought for power? Could it have been among the descendants of John of Gaunt, whose lineage was already controversial because of his relationship with Catherine Swynford? Or had the false paternity occurred closer to the Somerset line centuries later? No one could say for sure, but the implications were enormous. It showed that even royal families, whose bloodlines were considered sacred and carefully recorded, were not immune to human secrets, betrayals, and mistakes. DNA had done what no historian or chronicler could ever have achieved. It revealed the hidden flaws in the story of monarchy itself. For scientists, the findings were a triumph of modern technology. For historians, they were both thrilling and unsettling. The discovery forced scholars to rethink what royal legitimacy truly meant. If kingship could be based on records that might not reflect biological reality, then perhaps the entire idea of royal blood was more symbolic than literal. The story of Richard III's DNA also reminded people that history is never fixed. What we believe to be true can change when new evidence emerges. For centuries, Richard III had been remembered as a villain, accused of murdering his nephews, the princes in the Tower, and portrayed by Shakespeare as a deformed tyrant. But the rediscovery of his body and the study of his DNA brought a more human picture to light. He was a man shaped by his time, a skilled warrior who suffered from physical challenges but still fought with courage. In the end, the discovery beneath the parking lot did more than locate a lost king. It reopened an entire chapter of English history. It showed that truth can lie hidden for centuries, waiting beneath layers of soil and myth, only to be revealed by science. The DNA of Richard III not only confirmed his identity, but also exposed the fragile threads that connect the past to the present. The mystery of his broken bloodline continues to fascinate historians and the public alike, reminding everyone that even the mightiest dynasties are not immune to the quiet surprises written in their genes. What began as a search for a long-lost king ended up reshaping our understanding of royal heritage. The bones found in that ordinary parking lot told an extraordinary story, one of power, death, legacy, and the unexpected truths buried deep within the human family tree. The discovery about Richard III's DNA revealed something no one expected. It showed that somewhere along the royal family line, there had been a break, a point where the biological father recorded in history wasn't the real one. Scientists called this a false paternity event, which means that at some point, a child born into the royal bloodline didn't share the same Y chromosome as the man thought to be his father. While such events are not uncommon in long family lines, finding one in the direct male line of England's kings carried enormous symbolic importance. This revelation quickly made headlines, sparking curiosity and controversy across the world. Newspapers speculated wildly, imagining secret affairs and betrayals hidden deep within medieval castles. Some wondered if this was proof of a queen's unfaithfulness or a secret relationship involving a noblewoman. But historians warned against jumping to such conclusions, reminding everyone that there was no way to know exactly when the break had happened. There was no evidence linking the DNA result to any specific event or person. The truth was that a genetic secret had been uncovered, but the full story behind it remained out of reach. For historians who studied the Wars of the Roses, the irony was striking. Richard III had lived and died during a conflict that revolved around the question of legitimacy. The rival houses of York and Lancaster, both descended from the Plantagenets, fought brutally over who had the stronger claim to the throne. Each side accused the other of being less legitimate. Now, centuries later, DNA science suggested that the idea of a pure and unbroken royal bloodline might have been an illusion all along. The wars may have been fought over a lineage that was never as unbroken or perfect as people believed. The skeleton found beneath the Leicester parking lot continued to reveal remarkable details. In addition to the spinal curvature that explained Richard's uneven posture, the bones bore the marks of a violent death. Deep cuts to the skull showed that he had been struck multiple times after his helmet had been removed. Sharp injuries to the pelvis hinted at humiliation after death, perhaps inflicted as his body was carried from the battlefield. These findings matched historical accounts describing how Richard fought bravely until the end, only to be mocked and mistreated after being killed. The DNA mystery added another layer of intrigue to his story, but the bones themselves told of a real man, not the villain Shakespeare had imagined. A facial reconstruction based on Richard's skull helped bring that man to life. Using modern 3D scanning technology, experts recreated his face in astonishing detail. The result was a portrait that looked remarkably similar to paintings made shortly after his death. Paintings that showed a serious, intelligent man, not a monstrous figure. DNA analysis suggested that he probably had blue eyes and light brown hair, a combination that fit early depictions but not later ones, which had darkened his features to match the image of a sinister tyrant. This reconstruction changed how the public viewed him. For centuries, Richard had been portrayed as a villain, but now people saw a more human side of the last Plantagenet, king. The scientific study of his remains did not stop with DNA. Researchers also analyzed the isotopes in his teeth and bones to learn more about his life. These isotopes act like time capsules, recording what a person ate and where they lived. His teeth showed signs of a simpler diet during childhood, while his bones revealed a rich diet full of fish, meat, and wine in adulthood. Exactly what one would expect from a man who had risen from noble birth to kingship. The data showed that Richard enjoyed imported foods and fine wine, confirming that he lived a life of privilege. The physical evidence also helped to correct centuries of myth. Shakespeare's version of Richard III described a hunchbacked villain, twisted both in body and mind. But the real Richard suffered from scoliosis, a sideways curvature of the spine, not a hunched deformity. His right shoulder sat higher than his left, and his rib cage was slightly compressed. But with tailored clothing and armor, he could still move and fight effectively. The wounds on his body confirmed that he had been an active warrior who died in battle. He was struck by multiple weapons, halberds and swords, after his helmet was removed, showing he was surrounded by enemies at the end. A wound to his pelvis indicated that after death, his body had been further mutilated, possibly as a final act of humiliation. These details matched accounts written soon after his death, describing how he was killed at Bosworth Field while fighting courageously against overwhelming odds. Despite the overwhelming evidence confirming his identity, the Y chromosome mismatch continued to trouble scientists. When they compared Richard's Y chromosome to that of his supposed modern male line relatives, they discovered they did not match. The difference was so large that it couldn't be explained by a simple testing error. Richard's genetic signature fell into a rare haplogroup found less often in Britain, while the Somerset descendants carried a more common Western European haplogroup. This meant that somewhere between Edward III, an ancestor of Richard, and the modern Somerset family, a biological break had occurred. But where exactly? If it happened close to Richard's generation, it might mean that his father, Richard of York, was not his biological father. That would imply that Richard's own claim to the throne was not legitimate by blood. However, if the break occurred in the Somerset line much later, the problem might lie with them, not with Richard. The uncertainty kept historians cautious, but it also ignited fierce debates about royal succession and the meaning of legitimacy. The discovery of Richard III's remains and the DNA results caused a sensation in both academic and public circles. Museums and universities celebrated the finding as one of the greatest archaeological achievements in modern times. It proved that even after 500 years, science could uncover truths buried beneath myths. Historians praised the precision of the work, noting how perfectly the evidence matched historical descriptions. The age of the man, his spinal condition, his battle wounds, and even his diet. Facial reconstruction combined with genetic evidence presented a deeply human image of the king, challenging old stories and reshaping public perception. Yet for all its triumphs, the DNA discovery also raised difficult questions. What did it mean if royal bloodlines, long seen as symbols of divine right and continuity, were not as pure as once believed? Could the idea of royal legitimacy survive the revelation that biology did not always match the official record? Historians and scientists discussed how dynastic marriages often prioritized politics over personal truth. Throughout history, legitimacy was based more on recognition and power than on genetic accuracy. In noble families, appearances often mattered more than biological reality. A child accepted as legitimate by a king or queen was, by law and society, a rightful heir, regardless of DNA. This perspective reminded people that history is not just about genes, it's about how people chose to record and interpret those genes. The public's fascination was enormous. Leicester Cathedral, where Richard III was eventually reburied, became a site of pilgrimage. Thousands visited his tomb to see the final resting place of a king who had been rediscovered under a modern parking lot. Social media buzzed with discussions about royal secrets and historical mysteries. Many people felt a deep connection to the story, not just because it involved royalty, but because it showed how modern science could bring forgotten history back to life. For those descended from Richard's maternal relatives, the discovery offered a sense of pride and connection to history. For others tracing their ancestry through the male line, it brought uncertainty and questions about traditional genealogies. Genealogists saw the case as a turning point. It showed that even centuries-old family trees could be tested with science. Some began using DNA testing to confirm or correct ancient lineages, realizing that what had been written in royal records might not always reflect biological truth. Others urged caution, emphasizing that the discovery did not accuse anyone of wrongdoing. It simply revealed the natural complexity of human history. Over the span of hundreds of years, families, royal or not, could easily experience unrecorded paternity events. What mattered was not blame, but understanding. Beyond the scientific and historical debates, the discovery raised deeper philosophical questions. What truly defines a king or a ruler? Blood, behavior, or belief? Does legitimacy come from genetics or from the recognition of one's rule by others? Richard III's story forced people to think about how much weight we place on ancestry, and whether our fascination with royal bloodlines says more about us than about them. The DNA evidence reminded the world that kings and queens, despite their power, were human beings with human flaws, relationships, and secrets. In the end, Richard III's story became one of rediscovery, revelation, and reflection. His remains confirmed his existence as both a historical figure and a man of flesh and bone. His scoliosis, battle wounds, and reconstructed face painted a picture far more complex than the cruel villain immortalized by Shakespeare. The DNA results, meanwhile, complicated his legacy, showing that history is rarely as straightforward as we imagine. Some truths are buried deep, hidden for centuries in bones and genes, waiting for the right moment and the right technology to come to light. The story of Richard III reminds us that history is alive. It evolves with every discovery, every test, and every new question. The past does not stay buried forever. Even after 500 years, the bones of a long-dead king can speak, revealing secrets about ancestry, power, and the fragile thread that connects generations. Richard III's life ended on a battlefield, but his story continues to reshape how we understand history itself. Through science, myth becomes reality, and reality once again becomes mystery.